The night always seemed thicker in that neighborhood, like the air itself held its breath, waiting for something unseen to move beneath its surface. Streetlights stood in rigid silence, throwing long, uneasy shadows across the manicured lawns that looked too perfect, too curated, too watched. It was the kind of neighborhood where every hedge was trimmed to uniform obedience, every driveway scrubbed into submission, and every resident carried the quiet weight of being observed by eyes they could never quite locate. Even the wind felt hesitant, drifting through with a muted hum, as if warning anything living to stay alert. Beneath that artificial calmness pulsed a tension that wasn't new. It was an old tension, heavy, familiar, and sharpened by the kind of racial prejudice that people there pretended didn't exist. The kind they buried under HOA newsletters, forced smiles, and the illusion of community. But illusions were thin things, fragile skins stretched over rotten structures, and every so often the cracks showed. All it took was the right pressure, the right spark, the right person stepping into the wrong place. The night I arrived, the cul-de-sac seemed to sense something shifting. Lights flicked on behind curtains. Porches creaked under uncertain footsteps. The air thickened, humming with suspicion, curiosity, and a fear that didn't belong to me, but to those who had spent too long believing people like me didn't belong anywhere near their property lines. A cold stillness wound itself around the houses, as though the whole area held a secret it didn't want disturbed. But there was someone who felt that disturbance more than everyone else. Someone who had made herself the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's fabricated purity. Someone who watched from her window like a hawk studying prey, taking mental notes of imagined infractions, spinning narratives fueled by entitlement and quiet hatred. She didn't know that while she was watching, she too was being watched, far longer, far deeper, and with far more consequence than she could ever imagine. The first sign came subtly, barely noticeable to anyone else. A flicker in the street lamp outside her house. A brief interruption in the hum of the electric lines overhead. A shift in the shadows where no shift should have occurred. She didn't see the patterns beneath these moments, the threads weaving a story much bigger than her petty complaints and obsessive surveillance. She didn't understand that her name was already in a file she didn't know existed, buried so deep no ordinary agency would ever find it. She didn't know that her behavior, so casually destructive and racially charged, had finally crossed a threshold that summoned the kind of attention no civilian should ever want. And she definitely didn't know who had just moved into the neighborhood, the person she would soon try to evict. The person she would target. The person she would underestimate. The person she didn't realize had been tracking her for months before she ever laid eyes on him. The night trembled with the weight of that truth, vibrating faintly under the layers of suburban calm. Because sometimes, justice doesn't arrive with sirens. Sometimes, it moves into the house across the street. Sometimes, it watches from behind closed blinds. Sometimes, it waits, silent, patient, unblinking. And in this neighborhood, justice had a new address. Hit subscribe. Watch till the end. The morning arrived with a pale, washed-out light that felt strangely out of place in a neighborhood built on artificial perfection. The streets were silent, almost reverent, as though they feared disturbing the polished image they had worked so hard to maintain. Every lawn shimmered with calculated dew, every mailbox stood like a uniform sentinel, and every house presented itself with forced symmetry, no personality, no warmth, only conformity. From the outside, it was the kind of community people boasted about living in. But beneath the curated beauty lingered a quiet hostility, subtle, restrained, but unmistakable to anyone who had ever lived in spaces where their presence was quietly questioned. The kind of hostility that hid behind polite smiles and neighborhood bylaws, behind concerns framed as civility and rules crafted to exclude without ever admitting why. Moving into that world felt like stepping into a staged photograph, every detail arranged for show, nothing truly alive. The atmosphere pressed in from every direction, thick with an invisible expectation. Stay in line, blend in, be unnoticeable. But unnoticeable was not something the residents allowed from someone like me, not with the color of my skin breaking the homogeneity they guarded like fragile glass. From the moment I arrived, the gazes followed. Curtains shifted. Garage doors paused mid-close. Someone lingered too long by their car, pretending to check a tire that didn't need checking. The neighborhood didn't welcome outsiders, but it especially didn't welcome outsiders who disrupted its unspoken racial order. And even before the first complaint slipped into the HOA's inbox, the tension had already begun its slow, deliberate climb. At the center of that tension stood the woman whose presence dominated the entire community without ever raising her voice. She governed through insinuation, through watchful eyes, through a power she believed she deserved. Her influence threaded through every committee, every meeting, every whispered conversation. She didn't need a title. The neighborhood behaved as though she'd been carved into its foundation. Her approval was currency, and her resentment was a storm cloud no one dared stand under. She sensed something off the moment I stepped onto my new driveway. Not because of anything I did, but because the system she thrived in had taught her to see threat where there was difference. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I hadn't come here seeking their acceptance. I had come for something deeper, older, and far more dangerous than their quiet prejudice. And she was already at the center of it. The days that followed unfolded with an eerie predictability, each one tightening the unspoken hostility that pulsed beneath the neighborhood's calm exterior. What began as distant observations soon morphed into a pattern, one that moved with the precision of someone who believed she owned more than her property line. Every morning, the same figure appeared near the edge of her porch, pretending to adjust plants that didn't need adjusting, lingering longer than necessary, always positioned to watch. Her scrutiny wasn't subtle. It carried an unmistakable edge, sharpened by something deeper than curiosity. It was the quiet kind of judgment that came from assumptions formed long before she ever saw my face. The community followed her lead, the way flocks follow a signal they don't consciously understand. Joggers slowed when passing my home, pretending to tie non-existent laces. Neighbors who once waved freely now offered only stiff nods. Cars eased to a crawl as they turned the corner, engines humming with manufactured hesitance. The neighborhood had fallen into formation, an unspoken hierarchy revealing itself through sidelong glances and artificially polite distance. At first, these were only shadows in the periphery, subtle, dismissible, easy to ignore. But shadows have a way of growing when left unchecked. Soon, small disturbances began appearing around my property. A trash bin mysteriously dragged out of alignment. A garden marker snapped cleanly in half. The faint trace of footsteps in soft soil where no one should have been. None of it dramatic, none of it overt, but all of it deliberate. Each act seemed designed to test boundaries, to provoke a response, to send a message wrapped in suburban etiquette. The air itself changed as the days pressed forward. The humming tension that once drifted quietly through the nights now felt alive, following every movement I made. The neighborhood's silence grew heavier, as though every resident had agreed to maintain it while waiting for something to unfold. The woman at the center of it all moved with increased certainty, her posture more rigid, her surveillance less disguised. She behaved as though she were piecing together a narrative, one she had already decided the ending of, crafted from the same racial bias she smeared across all her judgments. But beneath their watchful suspicion, another layer pulsed, one they were oblivious to. My presence wasn't passive. Every shift in the environment, every pattern in behavior, every inconsistency in her routines was logged, cross-checked, and compared to what I already knew. The signals she emitted weren't new to me. They matched the markers of someone who had been on the radar long before I arrived. The neighborhood thought they were uncovering something about me. But they didn't realize that I had come here already knowing too much about her. The rising tension wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't accidental. It was the inevitable beginning of a collision that had been set in motion months before she ever saw my face. The breaking point arrived on a night when the air felt unnaturally still, as if the entire neighborhood had tightened its lungs in anticipation. The streetlights flickered with an intermittent pulse, throwing fractured shadows across the pavement. The atmosphere seemed to coil around itself, dense with the weight of everything that had been building. Her suspicion, her entitlement, the quiet racism woven through her actions, and the truth she didn't know she'd been circling. She made her move with the confidence of someone certain the world revolved around her authority. The path she took toward my property was rigid, fueled by a conviction sharpened through weeks of narrative she'd crafted in her mind. In her world, she wasn't just confronting a neighbor, she was purging a disruption, restoring an order she believed she upheld. The darkness embraced her steps like an omen, each one louder than the last, each one echoing the false power she thought she possessed. But she was walking into a truth far heavier than the accusations she carried. The stillness around us fractured the moment she crossed the invisible threshold, an unseen line she didn't know marked the beginning of federal jurisdiction. No committee, no bylaw, no neighborhood influence could protect her from what had already been set in motion. Months of surveillance, documentation, and classified findings all converged into a single silent moment. The shadows that lingered behind her porch, the faint hums at night, the flickers in the streetlights she assumed were faulty, none of it had been coincidence. Each anomaly had been a deliberate, calibrated response. Each shift in the air had been the presence of something she believed she could control but never understood. And when she reached for her final act of imagined authority, the truth unfolded around her with the inevitability of a storm breaking open. What she believed was a confrontation was, in reality, the culmination of an operation long in motion, an operation guided by the very agency she had unknowingly provoked. She had thought she was cornering someone she perceived as out of place. Instead, she stepped directly into the spotlight of the entity that had been building a case against her, the CIA. Her world, once built on dominance and control, collapsed in the silent realization that she had never been the one watching. She had been the one observed. Not for days. Not for weeks. But for months, tracked, analyzed, and finally confronted by the very presence she tried to push out. And in that moment, the illusion of her power shattered completely. The neighborhood slowly exhaled after the truth surfaced, its polished illusion cracking under the weight of everything it had tried to hide. Her downfall wasn't loud. It arrived with the quiet certainty of justice finally unmasked. The same residents who once watched with suspicion now watched with disbelief, realizing the danger had never come from the man they targeted, but from the woman they had empowered. The operation closed with precision, leaving behind a silence that felt different, lighter, honest, exposed. And in the end, one truth remained. Sometimes the real threat is the one the community protects most. The neighborhood's polished facade began to crumble, each perfectly trimmed hedge and gleaming driveway unable to hide the truth any longer. She had spent months believing she controlled the narrative, policing boundaries with unearned authority, blind to the reality she had ignored. And yet, the quiet operation that had observed her every move unfolded flawlessly, revealing the danger had never been on my side. The residents, once complicit in their silent judgments, now witnessed the unraveling of their constructed world. Power had shifted silently, undeniably, leaving them to face a question they could no longer escape: who really watches and who truly holds authority?